Good morning. It's good to be with you today. I'm thankful that every once in a while Pastor Jeff and Pastor Elizabeth called me out of preaching retirement, and so we begin in Jesus' name. This past summer, Larry, Pastor Elizabeth's husband, and I attended a conference on generosity in Indianapolis. And so because we arrived a day early, we took a walk downtown to find a place that evening for dinner. We came across this nice little Irish pub with some outside seating, a great place for a meal on an August evening. And after being seated, this friendly young woman arrived to be our server. She introduced herself to us as Cara, Cara with a C. But before taking our order, she said, "Tell me something interesting about yourselves." A little odd from a server in a restaurant, but there was such a genuineness to the question that we couldn't help but respond. And when it came my turn, I said, well, just yesterday, my wife and I celebrated our 36th anniversary. 36 years, Cara said. Well, that is something to celebrate. Wait just a minute. And with that, she dashed back into the restaurant. Well, we kind of looked and wondered what was going on here, but she quickly returned with 4 shot glasses full of Jameson's Irish whiskey. And she said, "We need to celebrate Dwayne's anniversary, and this is how we do it here." Well, it must have been obvious from the looks on our faces that the three of us were treading in some pretty unfamiliar water here, and so she gave us instructions. No sipping. We pound our glasses on the table together, and then we toss them back. One gulp. Well, we sort of shrugged, and we did as instructed, and Cara stifled some laughter at the coughs and the head shaking and the watering eyes that came from these 3 whiskey shot rookies at her table. And that's the way the evening went. More than a meal, it was a celebration directed by this young woman who obviously loved taking care of the people she served. At the end of the evening, as Cara brought our check, she said, "Well, this has been such a pleasant time that I took your beers off the bill. They're on me." I began to protest and say, "You don't need to do that." But she quickly cut me off and she said, "I'll be the one who decides what I need to do or don't need to do." And with that, it was clear there was no arguing the point. I wasn't going to take away the joy she found in being generous. And it may sound strange, but I believe the 3 of us around the table that evening saw it as a sort of holy moment. And that's why before we left, Larry offered what seemed to be a benediction upon our gathering as he asked Cara if we could pray with her. "That'd be great," she said. And so we prayed that God would bless her in the way that she had been such a blessing to us. And as we walked back to the hotel that night, it seemed that the best lesson about generosity that we would learn at this conference on generosity had already been taught to us. But more than that, we carried this spirit of contagious joy along with us, all because of the light we'd experienced in this young woman, Cara with a C. I thought of that story about someone bringing light for me because of these words in our God story today from Isaiah. "I will give you as a covenant for the people, a light for the nations." Light. Light for the nations. I suspect all of us know what a powerful thing light can be. I grew up on a farm on the prairies of western Minnesota, and just about every time we'd have a snowstorm, the power would go out, and so we'd go running to find a flashlight, but the batteries were almost always dead. And so we'd go to that old standby. We'd light a candle. Amazing how much light comes from that one little flame on a dark night. Or to speak of something even more current, I think of how many people have told me in the past few weeks how sick they are of darkness. The combination of way too many dreary, cloudy days and those early afternoon sunsets have left us longing for light. And that's why I'm glad for our neighbors that have more Christmas spirit than me and more ambition too. And so it's whether it's these decorations with a full Clark Griswold effect or something a little more subtle, the lights I see shining around me are a great gift on a winter night. Of course, there are much more serious kinds of darkness than power outages or early sunsets, like the kind of darkness Isaiah was addressing in today's God story. His words were speaking to God's people living in exile. In the recent past, they had seen their capital, Jerusalem, destroyed, the temple leveled, burned to the ground. Many of their family and friends were killed, with most of the rest carted off as exiles to Babylon. And it looked like a hopeless situation, like the darkness was completely overwhelming. But God spoke through Isaiah and said, hope is not lost, and darkness is not forever. Why? Because as we heard today, God will send God's servant. Now, it's one of several places in the book of Isaiah that speak about God's servant. And we don't know for sure if the servant Isaiah speaks of here is meant to be one person or several people, or maybe all of the people of Israel are meant to be servants of God. But whether God's servant is a he or a she or a we, what we do know is that one of the things this servant does is to bring light to the nations. It's Isaiah's way of promising that God is still present, that God's love won't be defeated. Like a candle burning on a dark night, God's light is still shining. Compassion and mercy, forgiveness and hope, God's work is still happening. And of course, it's not just ancient Israelites that know something of darkness. We see it in our world as well. It's found in the people of Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, or a dozen other places in the world where folks woke up this morning wondering if today would be the day when war touched their lives again. It's the darkness that confronts millions and millions of people in our world today who won't have the food, the shelter, the safety they need in their lives. It's the darkness we witness right here in our own country when natural disaster or violence leaves communities shaken and devastated. Sometimes darkness is found even closer to home, like when our relationships are challenging, when age or illness leave us feeling diminished, when the loss of someone we love leaves us brokenhearted. Or maybe the darkness arises from deep within ourselves as we experience the failings, the weakness, the sins that we can't seem to escape. We're not strangers to darkness, either in our world or in ourselves. And I think that it's our need for darkness, that's our need for light, that makes this season of Advent such a hopeful time. Each week as we light another candle on our Advent wreath, and every time we see another display of Christmas lights like this, it's our assurance that Isaiah's words of promise to us are true. God's servant comes into the world, and God's light for the nation still shines. Now, for us who are Christian believers, our faith proclaims that nowhere do we see God's servant more clearly, and nowhere is God's light shining more brightly than in Jesus. His birth, his life, his death, and resurrection, all of it is our promise that God is present in our world, that God is present in our lives. From the very beginning of the story, as the light of the star shines over Bethlehem, we are given the assurance that Christ's love will reach into every corner of our dark world. Which is not to say that somehow the darkness simply disappears, because we still know its power. But we also know from Jesus that it doesn't have the last word. Christ's last word for us will always be hope and forgiveness and life. That's the gracious promise we hear from the very beginning of John's Gospel, when Jesus is described with these words, "The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it." But one of the amazing things about the light Jesus brings is that not only does Jesus say, "I am the light of the world," he says to us, you are the light of the world. And with those words, Jesus invites us to be partners in the work that God is doing in the world. Or to use the words of our God story, Jesus says, like me, you also are God's servant. And like me, you are called to be bringing God's light to the nations. An amazing call. But we probably shouldn't be surprised by it. That's because that same call is echoed every single time we have a baptism here at Celebration. After the one who is baptized is washed in the water of God's love and named as God's beloved child, we light that baptismal candle. And do you remember the words? Let your light so shine before others that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. Now, in a way, it's kind of hard to imagine how we could ever measure up to a call like that. Jesus is light, we know that. But me? But I think it's helpful to remember that we don't have to somehow manufacture this light within us. We just have to reflect the light that we already know in Jesus. A kerosene lamp like this one once hung on the wall of my great-grandparents' home. You can see the lamp, but behind it you'll also see this polished reflector, a reflector that had the sole purpose of allowing the light of that flame to reach into even more places in that house. I think it's a good picture for us of what our lives can be. Because we know the love and the care and the forgiveness of Christ, we can reflect those kind of gifts in the lives that we are living. Now, a lot of that reflecting happens right here as we participate in the mission of our congregation. The Advent Joyful Well Project, which means that 4 new wells are going to be dug, providing fresh water for thirsty people. The Christmas Adopt a Family program that will be a blessing for families in our community. Our partnership with FACT, feeding area children together, that will provide food for hungry school children. Mission trips like the one heading to the Dominican Republic and other mission trips that bring God's love into various places in the world. In those kind of opportunities and dozens more, we are part of a congregation that fulfills God's call to bring light to the nations. But as important as our work together as a church is, the majority of our lives, they're not lived here in church. They're lived in our families, our communities, at our jobs, among our neighbors. And it's there, amid the joys and challenges of daily life, that we're called to let our light so shine as we reflect the love of Christ. And as I say that, I can't help but think of Cara. Cara with a C, whose story I shared earlier. Now, truth be told, if I were to run into her today, she might not even remember that moment when she was a light for me. But I remember. In fact, there have been a couple times over the past few months when the 3 of us she served at the table that evening have been together. And guess what we talked about? Or better yet, guess who we talked about? That's right, Cara with a C, with her generosity and her joy. And that challenges me. It makes me ask myself, will there be an opportunity for me this week, a situation where God's light can shine in my words, my actions, my life? Will there be a holy moment where my presence can brighten someone else's world? Can I follow Cara's example so the joy and generosity that I radiate will still be remembered 6 months from now? Will that moment come for me this week? Will it come for you? Just a couple of weeks ago now, we said goodbye to President George H.W. Bush. In the memories that were shared during that time, we recalled his words about 1,000 points of light, how together we as a country can bring some light to the world. Now, to be sure, 1,000 is a big number, and 1,000 points of light sounds pretty impressive. But do you know that there are 1,819 baptized members here at Celebration? 1,819 people who in their baptisms were given the calling to let their light so shine before others? Can you imagine what that might mean? 1,819 of God's servants reflecting Jesus' love and care and light to their family and their friends and their neighbors. 1,819 points of light for a world in need. I believe that was Isaiah's hope when he wrote the words of our God story. That even in the darkest times, God's light will still be shining. Right now, as Christmas approaches, we rejoice together that it shines for us in Jesus. But today I also give thanks that God's light shines in this congregation. And I also give thanks that God's light is shining in you. Amen.
Please stand as you are able as we